Welcome to Jazz Zone Together, our new online jazz community where we will provide jazz education and classroom resources, interviews with jazz educators, artists, and celebrities, along with valuable tips and repertoire suggestions. Today, we are extremely honored to welcome world-class performer, brilliant educator, and pioneering innovator in jazz education, DARIUS BRUBECK. DARIUS obviously grew up in a musical family and was involved in music from a very young age. His illustrious career has reached around the globe. Welcome, DARIUS. Now I'll turn things over to Dick Dunscomb to conduct the interview. Dick, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bob. And welcome, my friend. How are you?
I'm okay and glad to be alive. And I have a special reason for saying that. I want people to continue to take COVID seriously. I was in intensive care on a ventilator for 25 days. It's really better not to end up that way. On that cheery note, I'm fine now, but it's a serious thing. Don't mess with it.
I think musicians, and particularly jazz musicians, followed you through that whole process, and you had to be the recipient of hundreds and thousands of prayers, and we're so glad that you are back in good shape. And I have to say, it's such a pleasure to see you again and to have you with us today. Let's start with, tell us about your musical development in those early years and how that affected the path you chose to pursue.
It's a simple question with a complicated answer because I didn't really choose a particular path. I had many influences. My father practicing, sometimes the wonderful pleasure of Dave and Uncle Paul running over tunes together at home, sometimes the whole quartet, but alongside that, and I don't want to make this sound as if we were forced into some kind of pattern, but we listened to a lot of classical music, and my parents, both of them, loved classical music, modern art, literature, the sort of, and when I say classical music, they wanted me to have really open ears early on. So like some of the first music I remember really well is 20th century music. I'm talking about Aaron Copland, very accessible, but then also Bartok string quartets. And, you know, music that's difficult to play, perhaps difficult to understand. And this kind of drove an interest in what, from the standpoint, the first part of my life was in California. Well, the early bit until the age of 13. Then we moved to Connecticut, and this drove my interest, you know, toward music that might be considered unusual, though I was no snob. I loved the Beatles when that kind of music came out. I loved blues in particular, and my father was actually perhaps unusual in that he would bring home records by people like John Lee Hooker and B.B. King, and the more modernized version. He was an early listener to Ray Charles. In fact, he was one of the people already a bit further along in the profession that supported Ray Charles in some way. I don't know the details, but I think he introduced him to one of the Erdigans or something like that. People in our age group know what I'm talking about. Perhaps many of our listeners don't. But anyway, so my introduction to jazz was immersive, but my musical education was very eclectic and not particularly focused. I was just as likely to listen to Pete Seeger as Charles Mingus, and I distinctly remember listening to them both.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. It's, you know, when you were in college, I know that you studied ethnomusicology and history of religion. How did these areas of study drive some of your accomplishments in your career?
Well, the ethnomusicology came first. I enrolled at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, because in 1965, it was one of the few tertiary schools that had ethnomusicology. And I was very interested. Well, my father had been to India by that time. He was there in 1958. He brought back some tapes of little known people like Ravi Shankar and played them. And to be really honest, and you know, I may be being a bit hard on myself, but I think I would frankly say I was looking for some music that some way out of replicating the jazz tradition I was in the process of inheriting. It's not a rejection of it. It was never that. But, you know, if you look at the people in my father's generation, you know, Charlie Parker was born in the same year. Coltrane, Miles, Ellington, who I had the pleasure of meeting as a child. It was like, what lies beyond that? Not necessarily what's better, but what's left to do. Do you follow what I'm saying? And I thought, well, there's the raga system, there's African rhythms, which my father was quite a student of, as you probably know. There's other music in the world that has improvisation. But then to understand how to listen to that music, I became more interested in the spirituality of other cultures. I was raised in a climate where, yes, we knew Handel's Messiah and the B minor Mass and that sort of music that had very strong biblical references and references to organized religion, but all cultures have that, but in a different way, because the societies are organized differently. Well, how do you get to that then? So I've made a leap from music to spirituality to how societies are organized, and that means the production and reception of music and relating that to the belief systems. Now I'm describing ethnomusicology. Mm-hmm. So I followed those two paths in a parallel way. I had as many credits in ethnomusicology as I did in history of religion, but in my final year, I wrote an honors thesis in history of religion rather than the ethnomusicology, because that was more of a discursive scholarly interest, whereas the ethnomusicology, I was interested in playing instruments and singing and studying the production of music, the practical music. And I know I'm going on a bit, but what I'd like to share is that, you know, while I said that this was in a way pulling back from just being another jazz pianist who knows tunes and chords and can improvise, I was encouraged to follow that path by my parents. And I always will remember when I was filling out forms as getting, you know, as a student getting ready to go, that my mother said, because I could have taken piano as an option, and you know, I was discussing it with my mother, and Iola said, "You're going to continue to learn to play piano for the rest of your life. You've got 4 years ahead of you where you will have exposure to areas of knowledge that you'll never meet again in regular life. Fill up your schedule with those things that aren't just going to come naturally." And I thought that was terrific advice.
What a wise choice of words and a nice setting for you to enter into. Let's skip ahead a little bit in your career. Your program in South Africa, your jazz studies program, was groundbreaking. And it affected not only the music, but the social environment in South Africa. We know that you and your wife, Catherine, have been working on a book, and a documentary film is in the works. Can you describe for us how the program and your efforts impacted life there?
It was it had quite an amazing impact. We were supported by a wonderful group of people. I don't want to pretend that we did it on our own, but I was the face and the name. And Catherine, I should mention, is South African, and we met in the US. And this was during the apartheid era. When we started the program, it was really a way to push back against the regime and what it was doing. And the way it impacted was, this has become kind of a buzzword, almost a term of art, but it was like the beginning of transformation. Mm-hmm. The African intellectuals and political activists that we met in the US and in England before making the decision to go said that just demographically, however long it took, eventually South Africa would be a majority rule state, and that they would far prefer to transform institutions than to destroy them. In fact, that wasn't on anyone's agenda. So wouldn't it be great, rather than seeing it as an either or thing, wouldn't it be great if universities could be more adapted to what African people were interested in at the time, and more accessible to African people? And starting a jazz course, this was the first jazz course on the whole African continent, never mind South Africa, provided a way in for very talented students. And that meant Black students as well as white students, and students from all of the constituent groups. Durban, South Africa, where the University of KwaZulu-Natal is located, has the largest ethnic Indian population outside of India. And one feels almost embarrassed talking in terms that tend to classify people, but this was kind of the understanding of, excuse me, how everything was organized administratively. And by starting the jazz course, we really changed a lot of lives. And I don't mean only those who became professional jazz musicians or had the opportunity to study further in the US. Working on the book, which the book and the film, by the way, when they're released, will be called Playing the Changes. Good. And so it's, you know, it's looking from kind of inside the jazz world to its effect, you know, outside the jazz world. And we did a number of interviews for the movie and for the book. And what comes up, regardless of who's speaking, whether you're speaking to an African person, a white person, what they keep saying that through the jazz program, they encountered people that they would not have met otherwise. They wouldn't have met them in their churches. They wouldn't have met them in their high schools. And suddenly they were literally playing together. You know, then I would form ensembles and I would take a drummer or a bass player, you know, whatever. And these people became friends, and they never thought that would be possible. And there was remarkably little prejudice in the student body, people in that age group. And there was very little pushback against it. I think what we did was show people what life could be like if it weren't for barriers based on color or based on other kinds of difference, because certainly there were political differences, and certainly there, you know, one had to acknowledge that there would be tensions between different factions and religions and so forth, but that we could cooperate. And jazz is a great platform for achieving that. You know, and I think everyone in America needs more jazz now too. But that's, and maybe I've lost the thread of the question a little bit, but by bringing it, we also changed admission rules at the university, because our jazz program meant bringing in musicians, first of all. Many of them weren't academically qualified and had to be supported in various ways, and almost none of them had any money to speak of, and certainly if they started studying, they'd have even less. So we had to over time, it didn't happen just because I made respectful requests to the administration. Over time, we built up a good reputation, which in turn reflected well on the university. And this gave us leverage. I want to say us all the time, not in the royal we, but because my wife, Kathy, worked with me, you know, 20 hours a day on managing all this. We managed to build up a multiracial student body and a multiracial program that transformed the image of the university. And the people at the top, and we're talking about 80s, 90s, were quite pleased with this, because that opened the whole international world to them. South Africa was quite rightly boycotted and you know, was considered a pariah state because of official apartheid policies. But here was an institution that had found ways and means, some devious, some quite open, of not following those policies. And jazz is what made it possible for that institution, looking at it in a maybe through rose-colored glasses, but jazz made it possible for that university to be the institution it really wanted to be, an open, liberal educational institution for everybody.
Darius, what you've done there is absolutely spectacular, and certainly has to be gratifying for you to have chosen that next step forward, as you related in a previous segment. It just is wonderful what's happened and what continues to happen there. In terms of full disclosure, I think we met first at the Montreux Jazz Festival in Switzerland. And I met you and your lovely wife, Kathy. And then we became friends and carried on through IAJE and GEN. And I know that those organizations are very close to your heart. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, very much so, Richard. Yeah, 1987, probably, if any students are listening, that might sound like shortly after the Civil War or something. But it was amazing. I want everyone to hear this, that I was quite nervous. It was coincidental. I was there to play some duo sets with a South African guitarist who's sadly deceased now, Sandile Shange, and to cover the Montreux Jazz Festival for a newspaper that existed at the time called the Weekly Mail. And you were there as part of an NAJE, National Association of Jazz Educators delegation, and you had brought how many students? Quite a few, anyway. And I was a bit shy about approaching you because I thought, well, he'll know I'm American as soon as I open my mouth, and he might have even heard from me before, and he'd probably say, "What are you doing in South Africa? Shame on you." So, but it would have been good to make the connection. So Kathy said, well, he doesn't know me. He hasn't heard my name before. When he hears my accent, he'll know I'm not American, so I'm not breaking any rules. Let me talk to him first. Had your attitude been different, Dick, had you been simply following the political line of the time, we wouldn't have met. But instead, you were encouraging, and that openness completely changed my life. Suddenly, there was a lifeline to organized jazz education. Remember, at the time, I had the only program on the continent, never mind in the country. So it was like, oh, you know, there's people I can reach out to. I'm not going to just be rejected for doing that. And then that led to so many helpful interventions. And you encouraged us to put together kind of our university all-star group, which we did, to appear at the NAJE conference in 1988. And one of the decisions before the board was whether to formally adopt the name International Association of Jazz Education and become, or for Jazz Education, and become IAJE. And I must say, the group, I was so fortunate. Right then, I had a cohort of students who were just knockout, really strong contenders. And we also had music that no one else had. I knew it would be pretty self-defeating to buy some charts somewhere and try to teach our guys well enough to compete with your guys, so to speak. So I said, let's just do an African jazz set. Let's do original music. Let's just play the way we play, but polish it to, you know, to the nth degree. I just realized I have this here. We made an album as soon as we got home, the Jazzanians. Okay, I don't know how long you want me to continue along that line, but that set up a great precedent where now we had some credibility. We had done a good performance at the conference, important people on the board, and even members of the Art Ensemble of Chicago. That was such an interesting crowd around our stage, and everyone wanted to talk to us. Everyone was friendly. And that led to my bringing a series of groups to IAJE conferences. And very importantly for those musicians, quite a few of them got scholarships to study in America in different programs, postgraduate. So I kind of built them up to a level where they could apply to Indiana, for example, or Harvard or Western Mass, which was a power in that world in the days of Fred Tillis, perhaps still is. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, they came back as highly trained, highly dedicated musicians and teachers, because they were exposed to a higher level of jazz pedagogy than I could deliver as a 1 or 2 man department. And gosh, you know, we met in January, it seems like in a different century, you and I at Gen. The work goes on, the networking goes on. South Africa set up Dennis Keeney from Wayne State University came over and helped us establish SAJE as a chapter of IAJE. And that made us able to receive more help in terms of scholarships, in terms of exchanges. Great musicians came through that network, came to see us, spend a little time there. We received instruments through Jazz Aid that we distributed. Jamie Abersold gave us his whole library. I mean, 100% of his library. And it does my heart good to be able to say this to an audience that I think knows and appreciates these people. But it mostly started with you. Oh, Milton Academy visited us time and time again. The range of influential people that we had included like Chucho Valdez, Aaron Goldberg, Butch Miles came for a while. I mean, he was able to stay for like half a term or something like that. Larry Ridley came for a term. Those are people who visited in South Africa. Tony Garcia was there, of course, several times. Ron McCurdy and Willie Hill came out to have a look around. They weren't there teaching for so long, but anyway, it all counts for a lot. And Mike Rossi went to South Africa. Oh, here's something I want students to think about, and maybe junior faculty, if you're listening, is Fulbright is a great program. I've done 2 Fulbright professorships, one in Turkey, one in Romania. But the way I came to know about it was being encouraged to ask for a Fulbright visiting lecturer, because we needed a saxophone teacher in the early days. And Mike Rossi, Dr. Michael J. Rossi from New England Conservatory came out. Chris Mertz from UMass came, taught for a few years. Dustin Cox, University of Northern Colorado, UNC came. Brian Steele, who was at Berkeley. Chris Mertz is the head of jazz at Iowa. Do you know him? You probably know him, right?
Sure.
Okay, so you can edit this in or out of the interview, but I just want to say thanks to the people who made my program possible. And it was these visitors, those scholarships, the people with the vision to look beyond the, I will admit, lower level of academic qualification and hear the soul in the musicians that were coming through our program, and encourage them to develop intellectually, technically, professionally. And that's changed lives. It was transformational, and that's changed South Africa too.
Darius, you are absolutely, I believe, one of the only people in the whole world that could have pulled this whole thing together. And your heart and your manner and your soul are so clear that the whole world is beneficially impacted by your work. Let's talk a little bit now about your performing. We know that you perform many times with your brothers and with your dad.
Yeah.
Describe some of the most memorable performances of those times.
Well, let's see, we could go, or there's kind of layers of it. In the 70s, and I'll just kind of generalize about it. On the 70s, we were really seriously on the road. We were touring as a unit known as the New Brubeck Quartet. Before that, there was 2 generations of Brubeck, which also toured, but the NBQ was just my father and brothers, New Brubeck Quartet. And for me, 10 years before we met at Montreux, you know, I did that with the New Brubeck Quartet, and we had played at the Nice Jazz Festival. Do you remember the Grand Parade du Jazz?
Mm-hmm.
And what was, I don't remember a thing about what we performed, except I'm sure it ended with take 5. But for me, what was important was that this was, you know, like literally riding on the bus with Billy Mitchell, or being sitting around the swimming pool with Count Basie, or Dizzy Gillespie and my father, and to some extent, and I, you know, talked a lot. They were both kind of worldly men with interests everywhere. And just, you know, kind of joining the tribe. Now we were on the move with everybody, and the next time we might see each other could be in Rio de Janeiro, or in Paris, or where. So it's, you know, I'm kind of just generalizing about those years, but the main thing was coming face to face with the greats of the previous generation and being integrated into that world socially to some extent. So then, much later, we all kind of were developing our own career paths as leaders, Chris and Dan. But then gradually, Dave Brubeck became the equivalent. I'm not talking about musically, but he became like the equivalent of Count Basie, or Duke Ellington, or those people. He was now the older generation, you know, from being on the cover of Time magazine in 1954, representing modern jazz that was just being accepted then. Now that's the senior generation. So he began to have big concerts. And what I mean by those is kind of celebratory things. And 2 I'll remember are on his 80th birthday and his 85th birthday. So that's 2000 and 2005. The London Symphony Orchestra invited us all to play. And Chris and I wrote arrangements for the whole orchestra. And you know how much fun that is. I mean, how often do you get to do that? You know, write a chart for, you know, 65 men, women, whatever. What I mean is a 65-piece setup, you know, where you've got, you know, if you want it, you've got a bass clarinet, a harp, you know, the whole thing, except a sax section. But we had Bobby Militello, who plays as many notes as the whole sax section can play. He just fills up every second. So we were on as a rhythm section, and Dave as a special soloist, and that was a thrill. And on one of them, Stefan Grappelli was a guest artist, and you know, and it was a thrill to meet him, and he was very cool. I remember Prince Charles speaking French to Grappelli, which impressed me about it, who came backstage. And yeah, there is a recording of one of those. It's Dave Brubeck live with the LSO, London Symphony Orchestra. So those are those were the great gigs. And then the last gig I did with my father was in 2011. It was Ravinia, you know, outside Chicago, you know, and again, you know, it was huge, you know, it was big TV screens on the lawn and an orchestra. And, you know, you don't have like the freedom and in some ways the complexity and surprise element, like when you're doing a real jazz gig in a cellar for 200 people or something. But these big gigs are events that you remember, like wonderful wedding anniversaries or, you know, big birthdays, that kind of thing.
Thank you so much for taking us on that journey. My goodness, that must have been thrilling and exciting and invigorating. We know that you are also a composer and have created works in many different areas. Talk a little bit about your compositions, and then would you please play something for us?
Okay, glad to. I really, more than anything, wanted to be a composer. And I have worked in different idioms. I have to say that my brother Chris has done a lot more than I have in that field, having commissions for concerti for different instruments. He recently did one for a concerto for Sharon Isbin, who is a classical guitarist, and he has been touring around doing trombone concertos. But since we're talking about me, I've written, I think I'm not prolific like my father or like Chris, but I've written tunes. They're more than tunes, they're compositions, but they're, you know, I'm not aspiring to the level of concertos and symphonies. I can arrange anything up to that. You know, I can scale up to that for arranging, but for me, real inspiration, my best things have just been things that I can perform with a quartet. And they're mostly written in song form. There's some kind of formal experimentation involved. Well, when I say I'm not prolific, it's not false modesty. It's more that, now here I'll sound on the contrary boastful, that by the time I've got something that I want to perform in public, it takes me a long time to get it. So I wouldn't change one note. This is really what I mean. So I have a book. I tour with my quartet. We play my original music. It's not a huge legacy, but I think it's, I think it will, within the limited circle of people who know my music, I think it will be lasting because it takes on board all of the things I've been exposed to, including a certain amount of, I would say, structural rigor that comes from the classical side, but also the music that relaxes me and I find most expressive really is jazz and really is pretty, in a way, conservative. I'm playing the changes. You know, I'm not playing serialism. I'm not playing free. Because that's not because I reject other musical paths, but I think my job is to mediate the things that have come to me, that are focused through me, and that I can pass on to, or did pass on to my students. I don't need to experiment. I just need to find what I have inside me and put it out there.
Good. So what are you going to play for us?
Well, I was thinking I know what I'm going to play. It may seem a bit somber, but it's called A Sea of Troubles. And that's a phrase from Hamlet's soliloquy. You know, the famous to be or not to be speech. And I feel it's sort of right for these times. It's tempting to think, well, if I play something bright and bouncy, everyone's going to like it. But maybe you'll like this too. It's on my most recent album, which was recorded on tour with my quartet, the Darius Brubek Quartet, live in Poland. And it really focuses a lot of sorrow, which is what I feel, actually. My prevailing feeling is one of gratitude, as I said at the beginning, but I also feel very sorry about the state of the world today, shall we say, without going into a long sermon, but I mean that very, very sincerely. So it is like a sea of troubles. And oh, I'm going to turn it around just for a second. Do you see that photo?
Yes.
My father is a student, and Darius Mio looking at him. So that's why I'm named Darius.
Oh, cool.
There was a picture taken when Dave was a master's student at Mills College in California. Okay, well, we're on sort of a picture break. Can you see this?
Oh, yeah.
Dave and Winton at Newport. And you see the ocean behind.
Yeah, that's a good picture.
Yeah. And I always have this. I see this picture whenever I'm playing the piano. This is Duke by the Norwegian critic and author Randy Hulton. And so I've got Duke on one side and my father and Mio on the other. To either encourage or intimidate, I'm not sure which, but those are my icons.
That's amazing. And a beautiful instrument, I might add.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I can't begin to thank you enough for the time that you've spent with us today and how important it is for all of the jazz educators, jazz students, and fans. What a tremendous impact you have made in this world to all of us.
I'm hearing that with a humble heart, Dick, but thank you.
Thank you, Darius.
Thank you so much, Darius. To our viewers, we appreciate you joining us today and being a part of Jazz Zone Together. We hope you found the presentation of real value. We hope you will join us for future episodes. In the meantime, please stay safe and please keep making music.